Greetings, Nick Bowcott with Sweetwater here, and welcome to this video which is all about the making of this beautiful behemoth in front of me. Yes, my friends, this is Mrs. Smith's pedal board for the wah-off with the almighty Kirk Hammett of Metallica. Yeah! Sunday, March 8th, 2020 is a day that will go down in history. Why? Because on that day occurred the world's first ever wah-off. Yes, amigos, a brave soul called Mrs. Smith threw down the gauntlet to the one and only Kirk Hammett of Metallica. Now, not only is Kirk one of the most famous lead players to ever walk the planet, he's won every guitar poll known to man, and he's also accepted as a complete master of the wah and one of the best abusers of that pedal ever. In fact, Kirk's love of the wah is so great that when I had the pleasure of working with him on this, the wah book that was put out in the mid-90s by Dunlop, he wrote the following in the foreword. And to make sure I get it right, I'm going to read it from a piece of paper, because that's how I roll. To me, the wah-wah is a tonal crayon you can use to color a great many aspects of your playing, and it's right there at your feet. I love this pedal to death. In fact, the only way you could stop me from playing one is by chopping off my legs. Yeah, that's dedication. Not surprisingly, that sentiment remains today. In fact, when I did a Guitar World lesson with Kirk a few years back, he finished by saying this about his beloved wah. I love the wah so much that I not only want one in my coffin, I want my coffin to be shaped like a wah. Wow. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know exactly who Mrs. Smith is because she has a pretty large social media presence. She's also been in Guitar World, Rolling Stone, she was on America's Got Talent, and let me tell you, I've seen her do it live. She's an amazing shredder. She's the real deal. Incidentally, Mrs. Smith is the instigator of the wah-off. She's the one, as I mentioned before, that threw the gauntlet down for Mr. Hammett, and he gladly picked it up. So why are we here with this board? Well, after Mrs. Smith saw us break the world's largest pedal board record in September of 2019, she called us the next day and said, "Hey, I'm taking on Kirk Hammett, can you help?" How could we say no? Anyway, enough of my mindless babble. Let's bring on the man responsible for this beautiful thing in front of me. He's one of Sweetwater's many professors of the pedal board. He's a signal path savant. Let me introduce you to the one, the only, Alex Fernandez. And sure enough, thanks to digital magic, here he is. This is not Brad Pitt, this is Alex Fernandez. So you were involved in the world record pedal building thing anyway, right? I was. I helped along the way. I actually built a couple of the boards on there. Cool. We had a whole team of people though, so that was way too much for one person to do, but I was really honored to be part of that. That was super cool. Well, you could have done it, but you'd still be doing it right now, probably. Yeah, right? Probably, yeah. And into next year too, so yeah. So outside of work, I'm in a band. I play lead guitar in a band called Horizon Arcs, and I love building pedal boards. So in my spare time, I have a whole music room, and I build boards big and small, and it's one of my favorite things to do. I've helped build boards for other musicians in the building, and for some of my bandmates and stuff. So it's just been a huge hobby the past 5 years or so. Gotcha. Yeah. And one of the things, at the risk of being obsequious, one of the things that impresses me about your boards is they're always really neat, because when you look at one of my boards, it looks like an explosion in a spaghetti factory. It's just awful. Whereas this thing here, which is completely flat, is a thing of beauty. I mean, it would have taken me weeks to even come up with the idea, and you knocked this out in a couple of days because of the deadline. Yeah, it was a tough week. This whole build was start to finish, 2 days of actual building. There was a day of planning in there, a couple phone meetings and things like that. And the flat board, actually, there's a story behind that. That was actually a requirement. So for Mrs. Smith. For Mrs. Smith. So we had a few different, constraints we had to operate within. One was Mrs. Smith prefers a completely flat surface. Sometimes she has heels, sometimes she's going to be doing a really crazy performance with Kirk Hammett. Right. And she wants to make sure that the boards were as flat as possible and not on an incline, because that can throw off
the feel. So part of the flat design was actually from Mrs. Smith. So
and what makes that even more impressive is that when you've got an incline, you can hide the cables underneath. Here you can't, so everything is stark naked for the eye to see, and it's really impressive. I mean, you custom cut the cables, didn't you?
I did. So it's sort of a necessity, but when you have, like you said, there's nothing to tuck cables under, there's no facades or anything. So all the cables were actually custom cut to fit this board. The design of the board, the signal flow was all like in collaboration with Mrs. Smith. She discussed the order of how the pedals should be, and then we actually designed this layout to match her vision and her performance. So she wanted certain pedals on the front of the board so she could easily reach them and things like that. So
let's talk about the signal flow, because there's 18 pedals here on the two boards. So let's go from soup to nuts, if you will. Let's go from the start right to the finish. So you can be our guide, please. So where does it all begin?
Cool. So the hub of the board is this Friedman buffer bay. So we have all the cabling coming in through the buffer bay here, and a patch bay is a really great way to clean up a board, because if you have more than a few pedals, it really helps to have all the cables in one spot. So coming in from the buffer bay, so the guitar comes in, you're actually hitting the whammy ricochet first. It's really sensitive. It needs to be early in the signal because it's a pitch shifter.
Right.
So it needs to track with your guitar well. Then from there it goes to the Ibanez Tube Screamer, the Walrus Jupiter. A couple of the preferences from Mrs. Smith was she wanted a classic overdrive. So we went with the Tube Screamer.
Yep, no more classic.
And then Mrs. Smith prefers a muff style fuzz, and Mrs. Smith prefers her amp distortion. So, so for the muff style fuzz, we went with a Walrus Jupiter. At one point in the signal, we went with the JHS Muffaletta, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So it goes from the Ricochet to the Tube Screamer to the Jupiter.
Yep.
Into the Clone Looper.
Which is a cool pedal.
And she has something special planned that I don't want to reveal too much about, but she's going to do something cool with this looper that involves the wah pedals. So
makes sense. Yeah, because that's in front of, like the looper, my friends, is in front of all the wahs.
Yes.
But carry on. Next.
Then into the Boss DD8 digital delay. This came out this year. This is the latest evolution of the Boss digital delay, and this pedal is absolutely sick. One of the things that Mrs. Smith required was a delay pedal that was capable of self-oscillation and pitch shifting. So you can do some really cool stuff.
And you heard me do that really badly earlier, but when you watch the video of Mrs. Smith, it's really cool. I suck at this, but anyway, carry on.
Absolutely. So from the digital delay, we run into these two wah pedals. So Mrs. Smith handpicked these for this particular board. She wanted a couple wah pedals on this board, and then she wanted another board that took it to 11. So we added complete excess, 7 more wahs to that board. So this is the John Petrucci signature Dunlop wah pedal, and this is essentially it's the most tweakable crybaby wah you can get. It's got internal EQ trim pots that allow you basically have the flexibility of their rack mount crybaby, but in a traditional footprint. Then you go into the Weeping Demon. So this is actually a new one for me.
That's hard to find. I mean, they're rare. They sound great. They're discontinued. They were made by Ibanez. I borrowed one from a friend once, and I'm pretty heavy-footed, and I broke it. So, out of respect to Mrs. Smith, I'm not even going to... I just looked at it, but that's as far as I'm going to go. I'm not going to touch it because it's a great pedal. I hate to break it because it was hard to find.
I played through it a little bit in the test, and it sounded pretty good. But I know very little about this pedal other than that it was part of Ibanez's Tone Lock series back almost 20 years ago or something like that. But Mrs. Smith wanted this particular pedal on here. So nearly everything you see we actually sell. It's a current product that we sell right now, but the Weeping Demon is discontinued, and it's from another time.
Until we get a time machine, and that's just a matter of time, pun intended. So after the Weeping Demon, where do we go next?
Okay, so that's the beginning of the signal. That goes back to the Friedman, the buffer bay, and then this whole second board is in a loop in the buffer bay. So basically it goes out to the beginning of this, the Kirk Hammett Dunlop wah, then the dime,
Baby from Hell,
the dime wah, and then the Jerry Cantrell signature wah, and then 4 95Q wahs in series, and then back to this board. And Mrs. Smith has another very cool thing worked out for the 95Qs. We're actually fabricating a metal plate to go on top. That's still in production, but Mrs. Smith is actually going to use all 4 at the same time. So,
wow, that's pretty. Which is why the tread plate is off all of these. By the way, these didn't come from Dunlop like these. We took them off so we can put that piece of stuff.
So that'll allow us to bond the metal plate that's being fabricated to the wahs. And we actually had to make sure these were exactly aligned with each other, so that way when you put the metal plate on top, it won't buckle.
Right.
So that took a little bit of precision work, and then so that's currently being worked on, but that'll be a special treat for the show.
So all of the wahs are in line then. So we go from the Petrucci to the Weeping Demon, then to the Kirk wah with that amazing foot on it, the dime wah, Jerry's latest version of his wah, which is limited edition, by the way. So if you like that, buy one right now because they only made 500. Then these 4 bad boys will be linked together. Then we go back to where? We go back to the end of that loop, right? So back to the Friedman buffer.
Right. So it goes back to your buffer bay. It's beautiful. Keeps all the cables in one spot. After that, so Mrs. Smith wanted to be able to experiment with the sound of drive pedals before wah and also drive pedals after wah.
Yeah.
So we put another tube screamer, classic overdrive, and then your JHS Muffaletta, which is actually 6 different muff style circuits. So it basically follows the evolution of the muff, the classic big muff fuzz pedal through history, and it has all the different circuits.
I gotta say, that's a smart move, because if you've never tried this, there's a big difference between wiring distortion and distorting a wah, if that makes sense. So where the distortion sits before or after will make a difference to the tone and the feel. So if you haven't done it, check it out, or buy one of these boards. He'll build it for you. Now where? So we've got one more pedal we haven't discussed.
Yeah, so, well, actually from the Muffaletta goes back to the Friedman buffer bay.
Right.
From there, it goes to the input of the amplifier.
Yep.
So there's some buffers built onto this board to help with those long cable runs. This high wire buffer is doing the brunt of the work.
Right.
It's a dual buffer, really high quality.
This Mesa pedal here, yeah.
So the idea of a buffer is it converts your signal from a high impedance signal to a low impedance signal and allows you to keep your tone intact for a long cable run.
Gotcha, cool.
So that goes all the way to the front, the input of the amplifier. Then from the amplifier, the effects send comes back to the Friedman buffer bay. And then we go into the Line 6 HX Stomp. So she's going to use the HX Stomp for all of her post effects. So delays, modulation, reverb, things like that.
So time-based and modulation. Yeah, cool.
Exactly. And
this is pretty comprehensive, I got to say.
And it was a collaboration. This was a few different phone calls, some FaceTime. So we actually collaborated with Mrs. Smith. It was super cool. From the HX Stomp, it goes back into the buffer bay and then to the return of the amplifier.
Gotcha.
So, yeah.
So that's literally the heart. You were right. That's the heart of the whole setup, because everything comes from and goes back to that one buffer. That's amazing.
It just helps keep things tidy. So.
The question I have to ask, because I always mess it up, is the wiring, not just in terms of neatness and shortness of cabling and not having the pedals move, but the placement of power relative to signal. Can you explain what you've done here? Because it's very clean sounding.
Yes, absolutely. So because the boards were flat, it's different for each board, but the boards being flat made it particularly challenging. We had to make sure that we had a good strategy for routing the cables, for routing the power and routing the audio. And typically you don't want power and audio to run parallel. If they have to come together at any point, you want them to intersect at a 90-degree angle.
Right. Otherwise there's interference, right?
Exactly. You can create unwanted noise, and it's hard to troubleshoot once that happens. So we tried to keep them as isolated as we could, given the limitations of the format. But I think we did a pretty good job. And then also when building a more complicated board like this, we had detailed signal path. So I use Excel, but you can use any program. I like a spreadsheet format because I can use tabs to keep it organized. But I had the audio signal path charted out, and then that allowed me to figure out how I was going to route the audio cables. And then once I had a plan for that, then we could find another different route for the power. So
yeah, so this is a weird and wonderful mixture of art and science, really.
A little bit, yeah.
It looks cool, but the science has to be right, otherwise it won't sound cool.
Yeah, you make some decisions along the way, but a lot of it is science, like you said, but like there's a little bit of decision making and some creativity involved too with how you lay things out. But yeah, I was super excited to be able to build this, and I hope Mrs. Smith is just as excited, and I hope she wins. So we'll see.
My last question to you is, this is the Crybaby Battle Royale, it's been dubbed by Dunlop, who is sponsoring it. Mm-hmm. Are there any conditions and rules that you had to adhere to make this board?
Yes, so there were a couple little limitations. So one is, Mrs. Smith said we had to have around a 6 foot or less footprint.
Okay.
Granted, the whole theme of the board is it had to be XS goes to 11. The idea is it's a outrageous board, but we had to have it in less than 6 feet.
Gotcha.
There was also a strict rule of no use of auto wahs or envelope filters. So we had to make sure all the wah components were actually like treadle wahs. So yeah, and beyond that, Mrs. Smith had some different specifications that she wanted for the performance itself. So she's got it worked out in her head and how she wants to use these pedals. And so I tried to build it to her spec as much as possible. So
cool.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much.
Get off my set.
Okay,
now.
I'm out of here. All right.